Here is something that does not add up when you first hear it. Japan has one of the lowest obesity rates in the entire developed world. They eat rice at almost every meal. They eat noodles. They eat bread, cakes, fried food, and rich fatty cuts of pork and beef. They do not count calories. They do not follow macro plans or track their intake through an app. There are no point systems, no cheat days, no official diet culture driving the population. And yet the average Japanese adult is leaner, lighter, and metabolically healthier than their counterpart in almost every other wealthy nation on Earth. The Western response to this tends to fall into one of two traps. The first trap is to credit the food itself. It must be the miso. It must be the fish. It must be something specifically Japanese on the plate that explains the difference. The second trap is genetics. They are just built differently. Some populations are and some are not, and that is the end of the explanation. Both of these traps are intellectually lazy, and more importantly, both of them are wrong in the ways that matter most. The honest answer is both simpler and more useful than either of those explanations. It is not what Japan eats that primarily explains the difference. It is a single, specific rule that governs how much of it gets eaten, applied at every single meal, across an entire lifetime, without anyone needing to think very hard about it. That rule has a name, Hara Hachi Bu, and it predates modern nutrition science by several centuries, yet lines up almost perfectly with what researchers have only recently started to understand about how the human brain registers fullness, why it gets that calculation so consistently wrong in the modern food environment, and what the consequences of that miscalculation are over a lifetime of eating. Today I am going to walk you through 7 things you need to understand about Hara Hachi Bu, from the neuroscience that explains why it works, to the specific way it is embedded in Japanese eating culture, to why the Western approach to portion control keeps failing, even when people are genuinely trying. And stay with me until number 6, because it is the one that directly confronts the most common objection to this practice, the one most people raise the moment they hear about it. And the answer is more convincing than you would expect. At the very end, I will give you a single, specific practice you can apply at your next meal tonight. No app, no scale, no tracking, just one habit. Let us get into it. Number 1, the biological system that tells you when to stop eating has a 20-minute delay, and the modern food environment is specifically designed to exploit that gap. This is the foundational fact that everything else on this list builds on, so it is worth understanding properly rather than just accepting as a soundbite. When you eat, your stomach begins processing food and sending signals to your brain through a network of hormonal and neural pathways. The primary satiety hormone involved in this process, leptin, rises gradually as food enters and begins to be processed. The vagus nerve transmits mechanical signals about stomach stretch to the brain, and various gut hormones, including GLP-1 and peptide YY, signal the hypothalamus to begin suppressing appetite. The problem is that this entire signaling cascade takes approximately 15 to 20 minutes from the time food enters the stomach to the moment the brain registers a clear fullness signal. That delay is not a design flaw. For most of human evolutionary history, it did not matter. People ate slowly, ate food that required significant chewing, and ate in environments where the next bite required real effort to obtain. The natural pace of eating was slow enough that the satiety signal arrived before excess had been consumed. Modern food is different in every way that matters for this system. It is engineered to be fast to eat, easy to chew, and calorically dense. The effort required to consume 500 calories of ultra-processed food is a fraction of what it takes to consume 500 calories of whole food that requires real chewing and mechanical processing. You can eat an enormous number of calories in 5 to 8 minutes of eating modern food and feel nothing from your satiety system for another 15 minutes after that. By the time the fullness signal arrives, the damage is long. Done. You have eaten significantly more than the meal required, and the excess goes nowhere useful. Hara Hachi Bu, the instruction to stop eating at 80% full, works as a precisely calibrated correction for this exact problem. If you stop at the point where you feel 80% full, the satiety signals still traveling toward your brain will arrive and bring you to a genuine sense of fullness within the following 20 minutes without the overshoot. You end the meal feeling satisfied, not stuffed, not still hungry, but genuinely finished. The 80% rule is not arbitrary. It is the biologically correct stopping point given the 20-minute lag in the system. The practical consequence of this mismatch becomes clear in real eating situations. A person eating fast food, specifically engineered for rapid consumption, can clear an entire meal in under 8 minutes. The satiety system delivers its fullness signal approximately 12 minutes after they finish. Those 12 minutes are irrelevant because the meal is already gone. The overshoot is complete before the correction can arrive. Fast food's texture, salt load, and fat content are all features that accelerate consumption and maximize the gap between eating and the satiety signal. Hara Hachi Bu closes this gap not by altering the signal, which is biologically fixed, but by moving the stopping point earlier to where the arriving signal can still catch up before excess has been consumed. Here is the shift. Before your next meal, before you take a single bite, remind yourself of one fact. Whatever fullness you feel right now is 20 minutes behind the reality. The moment you feel 80% full, stop. The other 20% is already in transit. Trust the delay. Let the system finish what you started. Number 2, the history of Hara Hachi Bu matters because it explains why it works in ways that a modern diet intervention never does. The phrase itself is Confucian in origin, emerging from a set of instructions about self-discipline and moderation that govern behavior in ways far broader than just eating. The concept of stopping before you are fully satisfied, of leaving a deliberate margin rather than taking everything available, runs through Confucian philosophy as a general principle applied to food, drink, work, and social engagement alike. It is not a nutritional intervention that someone designed after studying leptin and satiety hormones. It is a cultural value that became a behavioral norm, embedded into how people relate to eating at a level deep enough that it does not require active decision-making at every meal. This distinction is critical, and it is the part that most Western discussions of Hara Hachi Bu completely miss. The reason it works in Japan is not that Japanese individuals are consciously practicing mindful eating at every meal and using the rule as a decision-making tool. It is that the rule became internalized early enough, through childhood, through family eating culture, through the school lunch system, through repeated exposure to meals eaten at a certain pace and stopped at a certain point, that it functions as an automatic behavior rather than a deliberate choice. The decision to stop at 80% is not a decision that needs to be made in the moment. It is a default that was set years ago through repetition and became as automatic as any other habitual behavior. This is the failure mode of most Western dietary interventions, and it is worth naming directly. A diet is a deliberate, effortful, rule-following system imposed on top of existing automatic behaviors. The automatic behaviors always win eventually because they require no effort to maintain, and effort is finite. Hara Hachi Bu in Japan is not a diet. It is an automatic behavior. That difference in depth determines everything about its long-term effectiveness. Here is the shift. Stop trying to manage how much you eat through conscious decision-making in the moment of eating. You will lose that battle consistently because hunger, hedonic eating, and food environment cues are operating at a level that conscious decision-making cannot reliably override. The goal is to install the automatic behavior at a deeper level through consistent repetition until stopping before full becomes what you do by default, not what you try to do when you remember. Number 3. The pace at which Japan eats is the practical vehicle that delivers Hara Hachi Bu, and it is almost entirely absent from Western eating culture. You cannot eat slowly and overeat as easily. The relationship between eating speed and caloric intake is one of the more robustly supported findings in nutritional science, and it works through a simple mechanism. The slower you eat, the more time elapses between bites, the closer the arriving satiety signals are to the present moment of eating, and therefore, the less overshooting occurs before the brain receives the stop signal. Fast eating compresses the gap between the beginning of the meal and the end, meaning you can consume an enormous amount before any feedback from the satiety system reaches you. Slow eating stretches that gap out so the feedback arrives while the meal is still in progress. Japanese eating culture supports slow eating through several structural elements that are largely absent in the West. Chopsticks, as a utensil, physically limit the amount of food that can be picked up in a single bite. You cannot load a chopstick the way you can load a fork or a spoon. Each bite is smaller and more deliberate by design. The The tradition of eating multiple small dishes rather than one large plate also creates a natural interruption rhythm because moving between dishes involves a pause, a repositioning, a moment of choosing what to eat next, all of which slow the overall pace of the meal without anyone deciding to eat slowly. The communal meal structure in Japan traditionally involves conversation as an integral part of eating, not the rushed parallel conversation that happens around a fast food meal, but actual seated conversation woven through a shared meal, which creates natural pauses in eating that extend the time of the meal and give the satiety system more runway to catch up. The result is that the structural features of Japanese meal culture produce slow eating as a default rather than requiring it as a deliberate effort. The same principle that makes Hara Hachi Bu automatic makes slow eating automatic. The culture does the cognitive work that in the West has to be done consciously, which is why conscious attempts at slow eating in the West tend to fade within days of being tried. Research on eating speed and body weight consistently finds that fast eaters weigh more than slow eaters across every age group and multiple population studies, and the effect holds even when the same foods and calorie counts are compared. The mechanism is the timing gap. Two people eating identical meals at different speeds will consume different amounts before satiety registers, because the slower eater gives the signal more time to arrive while eating is still in progress. Speed is not a peripheral variable in the overeating equation. For a significant proportion of people who struggle with their weight, it is the primary one, operating silently underneath every other factor they have been focused on instead. Here is the shift. At every meal this week, put your fork or spoon down between every bite. Not dramatically, not as a ritual, just set it down and leave it there until you have chewed and swallowed what is in your mouth. That one physical habit slows the pace of every meal without requiring any willpower, because the decision is made between bites rather than during them. Number 4. Japan's eating culture produces appropriate portions automatically before anyone sits down to eat, and this is the step Western dieting consistently skips. Portion control in the Western diet context almost always means taking a large quantity of food and deciding to eat less of it. The food is there, in front of you, on a large plate, and you are expected to stop before it is finished. This is an extraordinarily difficult behavioral challenge because the cues from the food environment, the visual signal of the remaining food, the smell, the availability, are all pushing in the direction of continuing. Stopping requires active resistance against what the environment is telling you to do. Japanese portion culture works differently because the food environment is structured so that appropriate portions are what arrives, rather than requiring restraint against excess. Multiple small dishes, each containing a small amount, rather than a single large plate containing a large amount. Rice served in a small bowl, not spooned from an unlimited pot onto a dinner plate. Fish and protein in portions calibrated to the meal rather than scaled up to fill available space. The practical result is that eating everything on the table, which is a normal and entirely acceptable thing to do, does not result in overconsumption because the table was set with appropriate amounts in the first place. This is a fundamentally different place to apply the intervention. Instead of fighting the portion environment during the meal, the portion environment is designed before the meal to make appropriate eating the path of least resistance. You are not fighting your hunger, your appetite, or the visual pull of food in front of you. You are simply eating what is there, which is what the human food drive is set up to do automatically, but with a starting amount that does not produce overconsumption. This is also the reason why Hara Hachi Bu as a personal practice is easier to maintain in an environment where food portions are already calibrated correctly. Stopping at 80% full is much simpler when you are eating from a small bowl than when you are eating from a plate that holds twice the amount your body needs at that meal. Here is the shift. Start with less on your plate. Not dramatically, not measurably, not with a food scale. Just physically put less on the plate before you sit down, eat that, wait 20 minutes, and then decide if you are still genuinely hungry. The question is almost never yes. The second serving, taken because the food is there rather than because hunger demanded it, is where most of the excess lives. Number 5. The long-term metabolic consequence of consistently stopping before full is not just about weight. It is about how the entire hunger regulation system functions over time. Chronic overeating, eating past full consistently for years, does not just accumulate fat. It gradually desensitizes the leptin signaling system. Leptin is both the primary satiety hormone and one of the primary regulators of metabolic rate and energy expenditure. When leptin is produced and received normally, it signals both fullness and a metabolically appropriate level of energy expenditure. When overeating becomes chronic, leptin levels rise, but the brain's sensitivity to leptin signals decreases, a process called leptin resistance. The brain stops hearing the satiety signal clearly, appetite regulation becomes impaired, and the body's ability to self-regulate intake without conscious effort is progressively degraded. This is why chronic overeating makes it progressively harder to stop overeating, and why people who have been in a pattern of eating past full for years find it genuinely more difficult to recognize fullness signals than people who have been eating to 80% for the same period. The satiety system has been systematically numbed by the repeated experience of overriding its signals, and restoring sensitivity takes consistent time and consistent behavior. Populations that have practiced Hara Hachi Bu across generations are essentially maintaining the sensitivity of the leptin system at a population level. The average Japanese adult has a hunger regulation system that works more accurately than the average Western adults because it has been trained by decades of eating patterns that do not habitually override its signals. The result is not just that they eat less, it is that they feel full on less, that their appetite signals are calibrated more accurately to their actual energy needs, and that self-regulation of intake requires less conscious effort because the biological system doing that regulation is functioning properly. The genuinely useful piece of this biological picture is that leptin sensitivity is not permanently lost once it begins to degrade. Sensitivity at the receptor level restores when chronically elevated leptin levels come down, and leptin levels come down when caloric intake is consistently moderated rather than chronically in excess. People who have practiced Hara Hachi Bu after years of habitual overeating describe a tangible shift in how hunger signals feel, arriving earlier in the eating window, reading more accurately, and resolving more cleanly after the meal ends. The system repairs itself. The primary input required for that repair is consistent behavioral change at mealtimes, sustained over weeks to months, not a pharmaceutical intervention or a dramatic overnight dietary overhaul. Here is the shift. Every time you eat past full, you are training your satiety system to deliver its signal later and softer. Every time you stop at 80%, you are preserving its sensitivity and accuracy. The meal in front of you is not just food. It is a training session for a system that regulates your weight and your hunger across decades. Train it well. Number 6. This is the one I promised you. The objection almost everyone has the moment they hear about eating to 80% full and why it is less solid than it feels. The objection is this: stopping before you are full sounds miserable. You sit down for a meal, you enjoy the food, you want more, and instead you are supposed to stop on purpose while there is still food available and desire present. It sounds like chronic mild deprivation. It sounds like every meal ends in a small defeat rather than a satisfaction. Nobody wants to eat like that, and no practice structured around feeling slightly unsatisfied at every meal will ever survive contact with real life for more than a few weeks. This objection feels strong. It is, in fact, the reason most Western people try Hara Hachi Bu briefly and abandon it. But the objection contains a foundational error, and the error is this. It assumes that the feeling of fullness you currently experience at the end of a meal is a neutral or natural standard. It is not. For most people who have been eating past full consistently, the current felt sense of fullness at the end of a satisfying meal is the product of a recalibrated, desensitized satiety system. You need to eat past the biological signal to feel the satisfied ending you expect, because years of eating past that signal have pushed the felt sense of completion further along the eating curve than biology requires. When people practice Hara Hachi Bu consistently for 3 to 4 weeks, something changes. The felt sense of completion begins to shift back toward the biological signal. The 20-minute fullness that follows an 80% meal begins to register as genuine satisfaction rather than mild deprivation. The ending of a meal stops feeling like stopping early and starts feeling like stopping correctly. The system recalibrates. And once it recalibrates, eating to 80% does not feel like restraint. It feels like eating until you are done. The Japanese person who has practiced this since childhood is not practicing chronic mild deprivation. They are eating until they feel finished, and the point where they feel finished happens to correspond to approximately 80% of what a Westerner would call full, because their satiety system has not been stretched by decades of habitual overeating. The practice does not feel like sacrifice. Sacrifice is what the recalibration period feels like, and it lasts a few weeks at most. The timeline is worth being clear about. For people who have eaten past full consistently for years, the first 2 weeks will feel uncomfortable. The familiar satisfaction a meal ending usually brings will not arrive on cue. That discomfort is simply not failure. It is the recalibration occurring. Here is the shift. Commit to this for 4 weeks before forming an opinion about whether it works or whether it is sustainable. Your current felt sense of fullness is not a reliable baseline. It is the output of whatever eating pattern trained it. Change the input consistently for 4 weeks, and the output changes. Number 7. The comparison between Hara Hachi Bu and calorie tracking reveals something fundamental about why behavioral interventions succeed or fail over time. Calorie counting works in the short term for almost everyone who does it properly. The mechanism is clear, the feedback is immediate if you use an app, and the mathematical relationship between intake and weight is real. For a period of weeks to a few months, many people achieve measurable results through careful tracking. And then, for the overwhelming majority of people, it stops working. Not because the mechanism broke, but because the behavior stops being maintained. The reason the behavior stops is not willpower failure or character weakness, it is cognitive load. Tracking every meal, every ingredient, every snack, every drink, every deviation requires a continuous, active allocation of cognitive resources to a task that runs alongside everything else in your day. Over time, the cognitive burden accumulates. Competing demands on attention increase, stressful periods arrive, travel disrupts the routine, a social situation makes tracking feel absurd, and the habit breaks. Once it breaks, the underlying automatic eating behaviors, the ones that were there before the tracking began, reassert themselves completely because they never changed. They were just being overridden. Hara Hachi Bu does not work through cognitive override. It works through behavioral recalibration. The goal is not to consciously manage intake at every meal indefinitely. The goal is to install a new automatic behavior that eventually requires no more cognitive effort than any other habitual eating behavior. You do not think about how to hold a fork. You do not think about how to chew. Once Hara Hachi Bu is sufficiently practiced, you do not think about stopping at 80% either. It simply becomes what you do, at the same depth of automaticity as any other ingrained eating habit, requiring no more effort to maintain than the eating patterns it replaced. Social eating deserves specific mention because it is consistently where conscious dietary systems collapse most completely and most predictably. A tracking app becomes invisible at a dinner party. Macro targets evaporate at a holiday table. The social environment of eating, food laid out generously, other people participating enthusiastically around you, the cultural expectation of full engagement with a shared meal, all of these override whatever deliberate system was in place before you sat down. Hara Hachi Bu survives these situations because it is not a deliberate system operating in the moment. It is an automatic behavior, and automatic behaviors persist through social pressure, disruption, and distraction in ways that conscious rules simply and consistently do not. Here is the shift. Stop trying to manage what you eat and start changing how you eat. The what is almost irrelevant if the how is calibrated correctly. A person eating Hara Hachi Bu at a fast food meal will consume less than a person eating without it at a health food restaurant. The rule is independent of the food. It governs the eater, not the menu. 7 things, and the single line connecting all of them is this. The reason Hara Hachi Bu works at the scale that it does, across a whole population over multiple generations, is that it operates at the level of an automatic cultural norm rather than a deliberate individual dietary choice. It corrects for a specific biological timing problem in the satiety system that the modern food environment exploits. It slows eating through structural features that produce slow eating as a default. It is embedded into a portion environment that does not require restraint during the meal because appropriate amounts were placed on the table before the meal began. It preserves the sensitivity of the leptin system rather than chronically desensitizing it. It feels like deprivation only during the recalibration period, after which it feels like finishing correctly. And it requires none of the ongoing cognitive effort that makes calorie tracking and structured diets fail at the first sustained disruption. The thing worth confronting directly before you leave this video is the unexamined assumption underneath the Western approach to weight and eating. The assumption is that the body's default appetite system is broken and needs to be managed from the outside through tracking, restriction, and willpower. Japan's approach contains the opposite assumption. The body's appetite system works correctly when it has not been chronically overridden, and the goal is to create eating conditions that allow it to do its job without interference. Those two assumptions lead to completely different behavioral strategies and completely different long-term outcomes. Here is the practice I promised you. At your very next meal, before you pick up your fork, look at what is in front of you and estimate what 80% of it looks like. Eat to that point, then stop, put down the fork, and wait. Not 5 minutes, 20. Set a timer if you do not trust yourself to wait. Drink water, sit with the meal ending. At the 20-minute mark, assess honestly. Most people find, especially in the first few attempts, that the 20 minutes brought them to genuine fullness from what felt like an incomplete stopping point. That experience, repeated enough times, is what begins to shift the calibration. Not a philosophy about eating, not a rule you follow because it makes intellectual sense. A direct personal experience of the 20-minute lag, felt in your own body at your own table, that makes the mechanism real rather than theoretical. Do that at every meal for 4 weeks. Track nothing else. Count nothing. Just stop at 80% and wait 20 minutes. The result at the end of 4 weeks will not be a number on a scale. It will be a satiety system that has begun to recalibrate toward accuracy and meals that end at a point that feels right, rather than a point that feels like giving up. That shift is slow and it is quiet, and it is the one that lasts. I will see you in the next one.